He thought a question could test her. He didn't expect her answer to unravel his carefully built world. One trick, one waitress, one shattered ego, and the first spark of unexpected love. Hello beautiful souls and welcome to Ms. Love Stories channel. The place where love, drama, and unforgettable moments come alive. I'm so thrilled you're here, ready to dive into stories that will make your heart race, bring tears, and leave you believing in the power of love. Before we begin, I want to get to know all of you. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from, because in the next video, I'll give a special shout out to some of you amazing viewers from around the world. I can't wait to see how far our love story family reaches. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell, so you never miss a single emotional journey. Get ready to feel, laugh, cry, and fall in love all over again. Because every story we share here is for you. Now, the story begins. Rose. George, the billionaire, is in his sleek office, skyscraper skyline behind him. Precision, control, and power define every corner. He thrives on control, but beneath the tailored suit, a subtle loneliness lingers. Annabelle, the waitress, works in a bustling downtown cafe. Warm, chaotic, full of aroma of coffee and pastries. She is grounded, practical, and skeptical of grandeur, yet dreams quietly of a life beyond her routine. George sat behind his mahogany desk, fingers drumming rhythmically. Every deal, every negotiation, had a predictable outcome. He thrived on predictability. But today boredom gnawed at him. His assistant had just left a note. New hire for the charity gala. She said to be clever. A challenge, George thought. He loved cleverness, but only if it bent to his expectations. He sipped his espresso, dark and bitter, much like the doubts he rarely admitted aloud. Would someone finally surprise him, not merely flatter his ego? Meanwhile, Annabelle balanced 3 plates of croissants, dodging the morning rush. Her cafe smelled of fresh bread and strong coffee, a comfort that reminded her of her mother's kitchen. She was meticulous, resilient, and quietly proud. Yet, there was a small ache she couldn't ignore. Life often overlooked her. She smiled through chaos, but at night, the silence in her apartment whispered her longing for recognition. Not wealth, not glamour, just acknowledgement. George walked through his day in calculated precision. Every interaction measured. Every smile curated. The world saw a confident titan. Inside, he feared monotony and irrelevance. Annabelle moved through her world with warmth and spontaneity. She laughed at clumsy customers, chatted with regulars, and even on rough mornings, found small joys. But her life lacked the thrill George craved, unpredictable brilliance. Their worlds were poles apart, yet fate was sketching a bridge. Speech balloon. Have you ever faced someone who completely surprised you with their cleverness? Comment below before the story continues. George, craving distraction, chose the cafe for his lunch. He watched from the corner, calculating the moment to test her intellect with a question only he believed he could conquer. Annabelle, carrying a tray with precision, nearly collided with his gaze. Their eyes met, a flash of recognition neither understood. A subtle smile. A challenge unspoken. The universe, it seemed, was aligning for a collision of ego and wit. The cafe hummed with life, coffee machines hissing, spoons clinking, a soft indie playlist in the background. Sunlight poured through tall windows, casting gold onto wooden tables, dancing over polished espresso cups. To anyone else, it was just another ordinary morning. To George, it was the stage of a carefully planned test. He watched Annabelle move from table to table, balancing trays with a grace that almost seemed effortless. The air around her carried warmth, a fragrant blend of cinnamon, coffee, and a subtle hint of vanilla perfume. Each smile she gave customers was genuine, uncalculated. And that, George realized, was dangerous. Dangerous because it could disarm anyone, even him. He cleared his throat, rehearsing the opening line of his carefully crafted question. It was designed to reveal intelligence, but more importantly, to assert dominance. A power play. Excuse me, he called, standing abruptly from his corner. His tailored suit rustled softly, sharp against the mellow cafe ambience. I have a question for you. Let's see how clever you really are. Annabelle's head tilted slightly, a faint eyebrow raised. A question? For me. Her tone was polite, but there was a subtle steel beneath it. She didn't anticipate being tested today, but she could feel the energy emanating from this man. Confident, measured, expectant. Yes, George replied, with a controlled smile. If I give you a choice between two outcomes, one that seems profitable and one that seems safe, but both have hidden consequences, which would you choose? And why? The words, layered with subtle challenge, hung in the air like tension before a storm. George's eyes flicked to her face, searching for the telltale signs of hesitation or admiration. He expected confusion, stammering, a polite dodge, maybe even awe at his wit. Annabelle paused. Her hand rested lightly on the edge of the tray, knuckles faintly white. She inhaled, smelling the rich coffee steam curling from the cups, feeling the slight vibration of the espresso machine beneath the floorboards. And then she smiled, not at him, but at the challenge itself. If the choice is between profit and safety, she said slowly, voice steady, I'd pick neither blindly. I'd want to understand the consequence first. Because every outcome matters, not just the one that looks easiest or most profitable. And I'd act in a way that doesn't harm someone else, even if it costs me advantage. Her words were simple, yet they hit like a hammer against George's ego. He blinked, momentarily speechless, not because she was clever, he had expected that, but because she had seen through him. Through the artifice, the games, the invisible lines of power he believed he controlled. The cafe noise seemed to fade around him. The clatter of cups, the chatter of customers, even the soft indie music, all dissolved into a tense silence. For the first time in years, George felt exposed. Vulnerable. The fragile edge of pride quivered inside him. Annabelle, unaware of the magnitude of her impact, continued. You seem like someone who enjoys the game of testing people. But cleverness alone isn't wisdom. Sometimes, the person who questions motives, instead of chasing ego, is the one who truly understands life. George's chest tightened. His usual confidence, the armor he wore like a second skin, felt suddenly porous. He had expected flattery, admiration, perhaps even a nervous laugh. Instead, he encountered insight, integrity, and a subtle moral courage that unsettled him. He looked around, almost hoping someone had overheard and would validate his ego. But all he saw were the warm, oblivious faces of other patrons, unaware that an invisible crack had opened in the steel walls he built around himself. Annabelle set the tray down gently, brushing crumbs from her apron. Now, she added softly, if you're going to keep testing people, maybe try learning from them instead. You might be surprised what you find. George's fingers clenched around the edge of his chair. His mind raced, not with a retort, but with the rare, unfamiliar sensation of humility. He had been challenged, not mocked. Surprised, not flattered. And somewhere beneath the surface, he realized this was the kind of encounter he had been craving without knowing it. The cafe's warm light reflected in his eyes, and for the first time, George noticed something unexpected. A flicker of admiration, even affection, mingling with his bruised ego. This ends with George leaning back slightly, his mind racing. He didn't just get an answer. He got a mirror reflecting a part of himself he rarely sees. And he can't look away. Speech balloon. If you were in George's place, would you be humbled or offended? Comment your answer before the story continues. George left the cafe that afternoon with a storm in his chest. His steps were brisk, echoing against the marble lobby of his office building, but the echo inside his mind was louder. Annabelle's words, simple, precise, cutting through his carefully constructed armor, haunted him. He tried to laugh it off, telling himself it was just a fleeting challenge, a clever girl with a sharp tongue. Yet every mental attempt at dismissal faltered. The truth gnawed at him. Her answer had pierced deeper than he liked to admit. Back in the cafe, Annabelle went about her evening shift with practiced grace, serving the steady stream of customers. Yet, even she couldn't ignore the echo of the moment. She replayed the conversation in her mind, wondering if she had spoken too boldly. She felt a peculiar stir of curiosity, something she didn't usually feel about strangers. Normally, she would shrug off any interaction with the wealthy or powerful. But George lingered, like a shadow she couldn't shake. The following days became a quiet war of avoidance. George immersed himself in meetings, contracts, and acquisitions, trying to rebuild his wounded ego. Every time he saw an email, a notification, a fleeting reflection of the cafe scene, he felt her presence in the back of his mind, teasing and unsettling. He would catch himself smiling at the memory of her calm confidence, and immediately scold himself for doing so. Pride, he reminded himself, was survival. Vulnerability was weakness. Annabelle, meanwhile, found herself distracted. She would see a sharply dressed man in a cafe or restaurant and automatically search for that same piercing gaze. She dismissed it as imagination. After all, she had responsibilities, family to care for, bills to pay, and a life built on practicality, not drama. But she couldn't shake the memory of his intense eyes, the way his ego bristled yet softened in that single, fleeting moment of challenge. Both were caught in an unspoken tension, the space between them filled with what they refused to name. George kept convincing himself that she was nothing more than a clever momentary amusement. Yet he found himself scanning the city for her cafe, wondering if fate would orchestrate another encounter. He hated this. The unpredictable intrusion into his orderly life terrified him more than he wanted to admit. Annabelle, too, struggled. She had pride of her own, a stubborn sense that life could not be derailed by strangers, no matter how intriguing. But there was a warmth that had been sparked, a whisper of recognition that told her this man was different from anyone she had met before. Still, she resisted thinking too much. Life, she reminded herself, was full of temporary surprises, and none were meant to linger. The days passed in a silent battle. George found excuses to drive past the cafe, to linger just long enough to see if she would appear. Each time, he told himself it was merely curiosity, a detached observation, but each glimpse intensified the strange ache of longing he refused to name. He analyzed her movements in his mind, her way of laughing softly, the tilt of her head when listening, the way she balanced trays as if the world depended on it. Annabelle, on the other hand, had become cautious. Her friends noticed a certain distance in her usual chatter. She would often pause mid-sentence, lost in thought. What was it about that man that unsettled her so? She couldn't explain it. She liked challenges, but not this kind. The one that made her question herself, her judgments, her guarded heart. Finally, a week after their encounter, George attempted to bridge the gap. He sent a small message through a mutual acquaintance, an innocuous invitation to a charity gala, where she might be needed for volunteer support. The message was brief, formal, almost businesslike, but underneath it, a thread of hope stretched, fragile and trembling. Annabelle received it and froze. She read it twice, then a third time. Part of her wanted to reject it outright. After all, why would she enter a world of wealth and ego that had so little to do with her life? Yet another part, the quieter, more curious part, recognized an opportunity. Not for romance, not yet, but for understanding. Who was this man who had unsettled her mind so thoroughly with just one question? When she finally replied with cautious acceptance, a small thrill passed through her, quickly masked with careful neutrality. She would go, she told herself, not for him, not for intrigue, but because life sometimes demanded stepping into discomfort. George, upon receiving her reply, felt a jolt of both triumph and fear. The game was not yet over, and yet the rules had changed. He realized that control was slipping further from his grasp, and for the first time, he didn't mind entirely. For both, the week of resistance became a test, not of cleverness as George had intended, but of patience, of pride, and of courage. Every day apart built tension, a quiet drumbeat that neither could ignore. They were both aware, though unspoken, that the next encounter would be more than a simple meeting. It would force each to confront the truths they had so far evaded. Vulnerability, desire, and the delicate, terrifying possibility of connection. The act ended in quiet anticipation. George stood in his penthouse office that evening, staring out at the city lights, whispering to no one, "I didn't expect her to see me." Meanwhile, Annabelle closed the cafe for the night, leaning against the counter, fingers tracing the smooth wood, thinking, "I didn't expect him to matter this much." Two hearts still apart, held in silent, unacknowledged tension, each resisting the pull of the other, yet both inexorably drawn toward the inevitable collision that fate had set in motion. The charity gala was a grand affair, set in an ornate ballroom that glittered with crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors. Soft music floated through the air, mingling with the hum of conversation, the clink of champagne glasses, and the subtle perfume of wealth and power. It was a world George knew intimately, a world Annabelle had only glimpsed from afar, and yet tonight, fate demanded they cross paths again. Annabelle arrived early, her volunteer badge pinned neatly to her chest, her nerves carefully masked beneath calm poise. She had promised herself she would remain focused, professional, invisible in a sea of influential guests. But even as she stepped through the tall doors, she felt the subtle weight of anticipation pressing against her chest. She knew he would be here. She could sense him before seeing him, like a pulse in the room, sharp and deliberate. George, on the other hand, had spent the last hour pacing in his private suite backstage, rehearsing the encounter he both dreaded and longed for. Pride warred with curiosity in his chest, each heartbeat a reminder that control was slipping through his fingers. He had anticipated a polite exchange, perhaps a clever retort, but he had not anticipated the growing fascination that Annabelle had ignited in him. Their first glance across the room was electric, a quiet acknowledgement that the last week of resistance had changed everything. He walked toward her with careful steps, measured and deliberate, but each step betrayed a nervous energy he refused to admit. She met his approach with a slight, guarded smile, the kind that said, "I see you, but I'm not yours to unravel so easily." The gala's program required volunteers to assist with registration and guiding guests. By sheer chance, or perhaps deliberate design, Annabelle found herself assigned to George's table. She felt her pulse quicken as she approached, placing a gentle hand on the back of a chair, and greeting him formally. "Good evening, Mr. George," she said, the formal tone masking the rapid beat of her heart. "Good evening, Annabelle," he replied, his voice steady but layered with an undercurrent of tension. "I didn't expect to see you here, handling logistics." There was a faint edge of surprise in his tone, as if he had half expected her to avoid this world entirely. She shrugged lightly, a small gesture that seemed casual but carried quiet defiance. "Someone has to keep things running smoothly," she said. "Even in a room full of billionaires and celebrities, someone has to manage reality." George felt the corner of his mouth twitch into a smile. That same spark of intrigue flared again. How she could stand grounded amidst the chaos. How she could speak truth in a world obsessed with pretense. He wanted to challenge her, to probe further, but something held him back, a rare hesitation that softened the usual edge of his ego. As the evening progressed, circumstances forced them into repeated proximity. Guests asked Annabelle for directions, and she led them past George's table. An unexpected power outage left them both at the edge of the ballroom, orchestrating guests to safety. A misprinted seating chart had them working side by side for a tense 20 minutes. Each moment of forced closeness was a silent test, one neither wanted to fully acknowledge. George noticed the small details about her. The way she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear when concentrating, the quiet confidence in her posture, the gentle way she reassured flustered guests. He realized he had been blind to this level of composure, this effortless blend of competence and warmth, in all his other encounters with people who sought his approval. Annabelle, meanwhile, observed him in a new light. The poised, commanding billionaire she had seen in the cafe was the same man now, but different. She saw a subtle vulnerability in his hands as he guided guests, a fleeting tension in his shoulders when things didn't go perfectly. She couldn't help but notice the intensity in his gaze, not the gaze of judgment, but of someone constantly measuring, learning, and perhaps questioning. Their brief exchanges grew charged, layered with unspoken meaning. A misstep by a guest brought them together to straighten out the confusion. Their hands brushed lightly over a folded seating list, and a flicker of awareness passed between them, neither retreating, neither acknowledging the spark, yet both acutely aware. At one point, they found themselves alone in a quiet corner behind a velvet curtain, tasked with sorting through a stack of envelopes for the raffle. The music from the ballroom softened to a distant hum, the chandelier lights casting warm reflections across the polished floor. George cleared his throat, unable to maintain silence. "You've handled all of that with remarkable composure," he said, his voice lower now, almost hesitant. Annabelle looked up, surprised by the uncharacteristic vulnerability in his tone. "I manage," she replied simply, but the tone carried a soft curiosity, a subtle invitation to continue. He hesitated, the words he had planned for weeks faltering. You don't seem intimidated by any of this," he said finally. "The wealth, the attention. You don't act like most people would." Her lips curved slightly, thoughtful. "Intimidation isn't useful. It doesn't solve anything. And it doesn't teach anyone anything about themselves," she said, voice calm but resonant. "I prefer to see the person, not the power or the title." The statement struck him harder than he expected. He had spent years surrounding himself with admiration, with people who reflected his ego back at him. And here was someone who refused the reflection, who saw him for what he was, brilliant, flawed, lonely. And instead of feeling diminished, he felt alive, challenged in a way he hadn't known he craved. A soft silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant clinking of glasses and faint music from the ballroom. The tension was tangible, a fragile thread of possibility stretching taut between them. For the first time, George felt a mixture of humility and exhilaration, as though the walls he had built to protect his ego were slowly, irresistibly crumbling. Annabelle, feeling the weight of the moment, exhaled quietly. She didn't step back, though she could have. Instead, she met his gaze evenly, a quiet courage in her eyes. For a heartbeat, neither moved, neither spoke, and the world outside that small corner seemed to dissolve. When they finally returned to the ballroom, each carried a subtle shift. The forced proximity had stripped away pretenses, leaving raw, unspoken awareness. George's ego was still bruised, but curiosity and admiration now mingled with it. Annabelle's confidence remained intact, but curiosity had been awakened. A realization that this man, for all his wealth and pride, was not untouchable. As the gala continued, George found himself stealing glances at her, noticing the way she laughed softly at guests' mistakes, the quiet command in her gestures. Annabelle, too, felt her attention drawn, noting how he paused to check on others, how he maintained control, yet allowed small glimpses of vulnerability. By the end of the evening, it was undeniable. The week of resistance had given way to a tension neither could ignore. They were still wary, still cautious, still proud, but the invisible threads connecting them had tightened, pulling inexorably toward the next encounter, the next revelation, the first step toward understanding the fragile, unspoken bond that now existed between them. The night ended with George offering her a polite, careful nod as they parted near the exit. "Until next time," he said quietly, his voice carrying a vulnerability he didn't usually permit. Annabelle responded with a small, enigmatic smile. "Until next time," she echoed, a whisper that held promise, caution, and a trace of something neither fully understood yet. And as they stepped into the cool night air, the city lights reflected in their eyes, a shared awareness lingered. The world had forced them together, and neither could unsee the spark that had been ignited. The city had settled into a quiet hum by late afternoon, the golden light of sunset painting the skyline in shades of amber and rose. George's office, usually a sanctuary of order and precision, felt unusually hollow. He sat at his desk, staring at a photo on his table, a memory he rarely revisited. It was of his father, stern but proud, standing beside a young George in a crisp suit, beaming with unspoken expectations. The memory was suffocating, a reminder of the perfection he had been forced to chase, the approval he had been conditioned to seek. Annabelle, meanwhile, was closing the cafe for the evening. Her fingers lingered on the worn counter, tracing the grooves etched by years of hard work. She thought of her mother, who had taught her resilience and kindness, and of her own father, long absent, leaving behind a hole that no amount of determination could fill. She had built her life carefully, brick by brick, always cautious not to let anyone too close. Vulnerability, she had learned, was dangerous. Their worlds, so different, were both defined by absence, by unspoken losses that shaped who they were. The week of forced proximity had left them unsettled, drawn together by curiosity, but restrained by pride. Now, fate conspired to remove some of that restraint. George had invited her to a private meeting for the gala's post-event charity review. Annabelle had hesitated, but her curiosity overcame caution. As she entered the office, George stood to greet her, But something in his posture was different. Less guarded, more human. I wanted to discuss the gala logistics, he said formally, but his eyes betrayed a trace of vulnerability. Of course, she replied, masking her nervousness beneath professional composure. They sat across from each other, papers and reports spread between them. The conversation began with routine details, tables, donations, guest feedback, but the air was heavy with unspoken tension. After a pause, George leaned back and almost reluctantly allowed the facade of authority to slip. You know, he began, voice low, I rarely invite people into my world like this. Most either chase the money or the status. You didn't. I don't know why that matters so much to me, but it does. Annabelle's eyes widened slightly. She felt a tremor in her chest, a mixture of curiosity and caution. I don't seek status, she said softly. I don't even think about it. I care about what matters, what feels real. George nodded, swallowing hard. I didn't always feel real either. I grew up trying to meet expectations, never allowed to fail, never allowed to just be. My father, he believed perfection was the only acceptable outcome. And I learned to armor myself, to control everything, so I wouldn't feel powerless again. The confession hung between them. It was raw, unpolished, a crack in the steel wall George had built around himself. Annabelle felt a pang of empathy, a recognition of a pain she knew too well, though different in its shape. She leaned forward slightly, the warmth in her eyes softening. I understand that, she said quietly. I didn't have a father around either. And my mother, she worked tirelessly, so I grew up learning to carry more than my share. I've learned to survive, to be careful, to never rely on anyone. But it comes at a cost. You learn to hide pieces of yourself that maybe shouldn't be hidden. George looked at her, surprised by the resonance in her words. He had expected empathy, perhaps, but not understanding that mirrored his own wounds. The similarity of their scars, different origins, same weight, created a silent bridge between them. For a long moment, they sat in quiet reflection. The hum of the city outside was distant, almost irrelevant. Both were aware of the fragile intimacy forming in this unplanned space. Then, without fully intending it, Annabelle shared a memory she rarely voiced aloud. When I was 12, she began, voice barely above a whisper. I saved my mother from a small fire in the kitchen. I was scared, but I acted because she needed me. And when she hugged me afterward, I realized, courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about acting anyway. But fear, it never really goes away. You just carry it differently. George's breath caught. There was a depth to her courage, tempered by vulnerability, that left him speechless. Here was a woman who had faced real danger, real stakes, and emerged not hardened, but alive and compassionate. He felt both awe and shame, because compared to her, his battles had been abstract, emotional, and often self-imposed. He exhaled slowly, almost as if releasing years of tension. I envy that, he said quietly. I've faced challenges, but I've spent so much time hiding from them, hiding from myself. Seeing how you move through life, it's enlightening. Annabelle looked at him, her gaze softening. Enlightening, she repeated, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Or humbling. George chuckled softly, the sound rare, genuine. Both, he admitted. And terrifying. Their conversation lingered into the night, drifting from memories of childhood to personal failures, moments of shame, and quiet triumphs. Each revelation peeled away layers of pretense, leaving vulnerability and authenticity exposed. For the first time, George did not feel the need to dominate the interaction. And Annabelle, for the first time in years, allowed herself to step into the presence of someone whose strength was not diminished by her own. By the end of the evening, they were no longer merely the billionaire and the waitress, the tester and the tested. They were two people navigating past wounds, discovering similarities in their struggles, and realizing that understanding often came from shared pain, not shared status. As Annabelle prepared to leave, George stood by the doorway, his usual confidence tempered with hesitation. Thank you, he said softly. For sharing that, for trusting me with it. She smiled, a genuine luminous expression that reached her eyes. We're all carrying pieces of the past, she said. Sometimes sharing them doesn't make you weaker. It makes you human. George watched her walk into the night, the city lights reflecting in her eyes. For the first time, he understood that connection was not about ego or power. It was about vulnerability, courage, and the willingness to see another person truly. And in that moment, an unspoken promise lingered between them, fragile but undeniable. They had both been tested, not by wealth, status, or clever questions, but by the quiet courage to reveal themselves, and in doing so, they had begun to build a bond that could withstand more than pride or circumstance. The morning after the gala, George found himself unable to focus on anything else. The hum of his office, the sharp angles of the skyline outside, even the neatly stacked reports on his desk, all seemed dull compared to the memory of Annabelle's calm eyes and soft laughter. He poured himself a coffee, black and bitter as usual, yet it barely touched the tension in his chest. Across town, Annabelle brewed tea in her small apartment, sunlight spilling across the modest counter. Her thoughts, uninvited yet persistent, circled the same man. She shook her head, trying to dismiss it as curiosity. She wasn't used to feeling drawn to anyone in this way. She had spent years building walls, and now someone wealthy, unpredictable, and infuriating, had walked right into the center of her carefully constructed life. Their worlds collided again later that week, under less formal circumstances. George, needing insight for a new charitable initiative, insisted she accompany him to visit a local shelter where volunteers were needed. She agreed cautiously, reminding herself that this was about responsibility, not intrigue. The shelter was small and bustling, filled with children laughing, dogs barking, and the scent of old wood and cleaning supplies. George moved through the space with his usual precision, but his usual armor was softening. He noticed Annabelle's ease in the chaos, the way she knelt to speak gently to the children, how she listened intently to the volunteers, offering guidance without condescension. "You seem natural here," George said quietly, walking beside her. "Like you belong." Annabelle shrugged lightly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I just listen," she said softly. "And I try not to make it about me. Life's easier when you focus on helping instead of impressing." Her simplicity, her humility, fascinated him. For the first time in years, George didn't feel the need to dominate, to assert control. He walked beside her, observing, learning from her manner, the quiet power in her gentleness. They spent the afternoon sorting donations, organizing schedules, and talking, really talking, for the first time without games or tests. George shared anecdotes from his childhood, moments of insecurity he had never revealed, and Annabelle listened, nodding, offering soft insights that made him pause and reconsider his own assumptions. "You really think I don't see the power in you?" George asked cautiously as they carried boxes together. Annabelle's smile was gentle, almost teasing. "I see it. I just don't care for it. Not in the way most people do." Her words, soft but loaded, struck him with a quiet force. She wasn't intimidated. She wasn't enamored by his wealth or status. She valued honesty, integrity, presence. And slowly, George realized he wanted her approval, not as a conquest, but because it felt like recognition for the person he had always hidden. As they worked, a sudden mishap occurred. A box of donated books toppled over, scattering across the floor. George bent down to pick them up, cursing softly under his breath. Annabelle laughed, a warm, lilting sound that seemed to make the room lighter. "You're impossible," she said, still smiling, handing him a pile of books. "I'll take that as a compliment," he replied, smirking. For the first time, he allowed himself a rare moment of lightheartedness without ego. The day continued with small moments of connection. George noticed the subtle details. The gentle way she adjusted a child's scarf, the careful attention she paid to each volunteer, the way she laughed at small mistakes without judgment. Annabelle, too, noticed his gestures. How he paused to make sure the kids were safe, the patience in his voice, the rare, unguarded expressions that slipped past his usually stoic demeanor. During a quiet break, they sat on the edge of the playground, sipping water and watching the children play. George exhaled, letting a rare vulnerability surface. "I never expected to enjoy this," he admitted. "Being here, with people who need me for more than my money, it's humbling." Annabelle looked at him thoughtfully. "It's different when you see what you can do without the trappings." The real impact, not the spectacle. The conversation flowed naturally, easy and unforced. Humor began to fill the spaces where tension had once lurked. She teased him gently about his meticulousness. He made exaggerated complaints about her effortless grace in the chaos. Laughter became a bridge, connecting the spaces between their guarded hearts. By the end of the day, both felt the subtle shift. The walls they had built, pride, fear, ego, were softened by shared moments of vulnerability and joy. George, who had always relied on control, began to understand the beauty and unpredictability in letting someone see the flawed, tender parts of himself. Annabelle, who had long relied on self-reliance, discovered a quiet trust forming, a willingness to allow someone into her carefully constructed world. As they left the shelter, walking down the quiet streets illuminated by soft streetlights, George's hand brushed against hers. Not deliberately, but the contact lingered. Neither withdrew immediately. Neither spoke, yet the silence between them spoke volumes. Finally, George cleared his throat. "Thank you for today," he said, voice low, almost vulnerable. "For being here." Annabelle smiled softly, meeting his gaze. "You don't need to thank me," she said. "I wanted to be here. And I think we both needed this, even if we didn't realize it." He nodded, a small, rare smile tugging at his lips. "Maybe we did." And as they walked their separate ways that night, a quiet, undeniable truth settled between them. Trust had begun to form, fragile yet resilient. Connection had deepened, softening pride and resistance. And the spark that had begun with a trick question in a cafe was now evolving into something far more profound. Something neither of them could ignore. The city glittered below George's penthouse that evening, but inside, the light was harsh, artificial, reflecting off the polished marble like cold judgment. He had been expecting a quiet night, maybe a chance to process the past weeks, maybe even a sense of clarity about Annabelle. But instead, the phone call had thrown him into a storm. "George," his assistant's voice trembled with a mix of concern and apprehension. "You need to see this. It's about Annabelle." He frowned, heart thudding in a way that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with dread. The screen displayed a social media post, one of those viral, fleeting moments meant to provoke, entertain, and wound. There she was, Annabelle, in a photo with another man at a charity event he had never been invited to, laughing as if the world had no consequences. The caption implied intimacy, but in reality it was innocent, an old acquaintance, a volunteer colleague. Still, the image, coupled with George's bruised ego, twisted into something far more dangerous. Anger surged first, then disbelief, then a crushing wave of humiliation. He had thought they were building trust, a fragile, precious bond. And now, in an instant, it seemed shattered. Meanwhile, Annabelle was at her apartment, unaware of the storm brewing above. She had spent the evening helping organize donations at a late-night fundraiser, feeling the familiar satisfaction of being useful. When she returned, she found her phone flooded with messages from friends. George saw the photo. "Is everything okay? Be careful." Confused and anxious, she scrolled through, only to see George's name flash across the screen, followed by a message that was short, clipped, and uncharacteristically cold. "We need to talk. Tonight. Now." Her stomach twisted. She knew instantly what this was about. Not the photo itself, but the misunderstanding, the assumptions, the walls of pride and ego ready to collapse. She debated ignoring it, waiting for him to calm down. But deep down, she knew that avoidance would make the fracture worse. George waited in the office lounge, the city lights reflecting in the glass walls like distant stars he could not reach. When Annabelle arrived, she found him standing rigid, jaw tight, eyes hard. Gone was the soft vulnerability of their earlier meetings. Now there was only the weight of unspoken accusation. "George," she began, but he cut her off. "Why?" he demanded, voice sharp, the hurt barely contained. "Why didn't you tell me about this?" "About him?" Annabelle blinked, startled. I didn't think it was important." "George, it's not what you think. He's just a colleague, an old volunteer friend. Nothing more." His hands clenched at his sides. "You think that explains it? You think a picture of you laughing with someone else, after everything we've been through, that I wouldn't notice? That I wouldn't feel betrayed?" Annabelle's heart ached. She took a cautious step closer, trying to bridge the gap that pride and misunderstanding had suddenly widened. George, you're letting assumptions take control. You're letting ego dictate reality. I've never been anything but honest with you. You know that. Do I? He snapped, spinning slightly, hands raking through his hair in frustration. Do I? After all the weeks we've spent, laughing, working, connecting. I don't even know anymore. I thought you trusted me. Her voice faltered, but she held his gaze. I do trust you. But you're shutting me out before you even hear me. You're letting your pride destroy what we've been building. The room seemed to constrict around them. The sounds of the city faded into a tense silence, the glow of lights reflecting the storm of emotions in their eyes. George's chest heaved. He wanted to yell, to accuse, to push her away, but beneath the anger, a fragile truth lingered. He couldn't afford to lose her, and yet his ego screamed that he had been humiliated. Annabelle reached out, cautiously, placing her hand over his. George, don't let this break us. It's just a misunderstanding. We've faced harder things than this. Please don't let pride win. He pulled back, a bitter laugh escaping him. Pride, maybe it already has. I'm not used to being vulnerable like this. And you make it impossible not to be. Tears pricked her eyes, not just at his words, but at the raw vulnerability they revealed. She wanted to step closer, to wrap her arms around him and show him he was not alone. But the tension, the fear of rejection, kept her at arm's length. George, she whispered, voice trembling. I don't want to fight. Not with you. Not over assumptions. Please just listen to me. He turned away, staring out at the city skyline, fists clenched at his sides. The storm of pride, anger, and hurt warred with the ache of longing and the memory of her laugh, her presence, the subtle way she had made him feel alive. Minutes passed in suffocating silence. Then slowly, his shoulders slumped, the rigid tension giving way to exhaustion and regret. I don't want to lose you, he admitted, almost a whisper. But I don't know how to trust, not after that image. Annabelle stepped forward, closer now, letting the vulnerability in her own eyes speak. You don't need to trust the image, she said softly. You need to trust me. And trust that what we've built is real. That we're real. That's the only thing that matters. For a long moment he said nothing, just let the words sink in, the weight of misunderstanding pressing against his chest. And then slowly he exhaled, the tension easing slightly, the first cracks of humility showing through the pride. But the damage was done. The incident had shaken the fragile bond they had built through shared vulnerability, trust and laughter. Pride, misunderstanding, and fear had created a chasm neither was ready to bridge completely. As Annabelle left that night, she glanced back once, eyes meeting his in a silent plea for understanding. He watched her go, feeling the weight of their fragile connection teetering on the edge. Both knew that the next steps would determine whether their bond could survive the shatter point, or collapse entirely under the weight of hurt and unspoken fears. And in that silence, both hearts ached, bruised yet aware. Love, even when it ignites, is never simple. George sat alone in his office that night, the city lights below shimmering like a distant galaxy he could almost reach but not touch. The penthouse, usually a sanctuary of control and order, felt suffocating. Papers, awards, and sleek furniture surrounded him, but none of it offered comfort. All he could think about was Annabelle, about the fragile bond they had built, and the gaping chasm their misunderstanding had created. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing the room. Pride warred with longing, ego with vulnerability. Why did one photo feel like a betrayal? He asked himself. Why does my heart ache when I know logically it's nothing? He replayed the day over and over. Her calm explanation, her insistence that it was a misunderstanding, the softness in her voice as she pleaded for trust. Every memory pressed against him, forcing an emotional reckoning he had long avoided. Vulnerability terrified him, but so did the thought of losing her. Meanwhile, across town, Annabelle sat on her small balcony, wrapped in a blanket, sipping lukewarm tea. The cool night air pressed against her skin, but it did little to calm the storm in her chest. She thought of George, of the way pride had clouded his judgment, the way he had pulled away without allowing the truth to settle. She felt a mix of frustration and heartbreak. I can't let him retreat because of ego, she thought, staring at the distant lights of his office building. I can't let weeks of connection vanish over assumptions. The night stretched long and heavy, both of them wrestling with inner demons, both questioning their worthiness of love. George's mind returned again and again to the way she had looked at him, the quiet courage in her eyes, the subtle strength she carried without arrogance. She trusted me, he realized. And I almost let pride destroy that trust. He sank into his chair, head in his hands, heart aching. What am I afraid of? He whispered to himself. Fear of vulnerability. Fear of rejection? Fear that opening my heart will make me weak. The question echoed in the silent office, demanding an answer he couldn't ignore. Annabelle's thoughts mirrored his struggle. She replayed their moments together. The laughter, the shared responsibility, the quiet evenings at the shelter. She had allowed herself to feel hope, a rare, precious hope. And now, faced with his silence, she realized she would have to choose. Retreat and protect herself, or step forward and risk rejection. Hours passed. Midnight came, then the quiet hush of 1 a.m., both of them still wrestling with the gravity of the moment. Finally, George rose from his chair, exhaling slowly, as if releasing months of fear and pride in one trembling breath. He knew he had a choice. Let ego win, push her away, and remain untouchable but lonely, or set aside pride, admit his vulnerability, and reach for what he truly wanted. The decision burned inside him, consuming his thoughts. He paced the length of the office once more, then stopped, staring at the city below. I can't let this end like this. Not with her. Not over a misunderstanding, not over a photo, not over pride. He picked up his phone, fingers hovering over her number. Every instinct screamed caution. But another voice, softer, more genuine, urged him forward. Say it. Be honest. Let her know she matters more than ego. Meanwhile, Annabelle, sitting alone on her balcony, finally made her own choice. She would not retreat, would not allow misunderstanding to dictate the course of their connection. With trembling fingers, she opened her phone and typed a message, then deleted it twice before finally sending. George, I don't want this to end. Please let's talk. Honestly. No assumptions, no pride. Just us. George's phone buzzed in the quiet penthouse. He read the message, a surge of relief and anticipation rushing through him. For the first time in weeks, clarity replaced chaos. He typed quickly, almost desperately. I've been a fool. Pride blinded me. I need to hear you. Can we meet? Now. Please. Minutes later, they met in a quiet park, empty except for the soft rustle of leaves in the night breeze. The city's distant lights cast a gentle glow, creating a sense of intimacy, isolation, and possibility. They faced each other, hearts pounding, breaths shallow. Words were unnecessary at first. The silence spoke volumes filled with fear, longing, and unspoken apology. George was the first to speak. I let my ego get in the way. I saw a photo and assumed, and in that moment, I almost lost you. His voice cracked, revealing the vulnerability he had long avoided. I can't stand the thought of losing you, Annabelle. You've shown me what matters. And I don't want to run away from that anymore. Annabelle's eyes glistened with emotion. George, I've never lied to you, never misled you. And I needed you to see that trust isn't fragile, it's strong. But it takes courage. Courage to believe in someone when your pride wants you to pull away. He took a cautious step closer, voice trembling. I have that courage now. I choose you, Annabelle. Even if it scares me. Her lips quivered as she smiled through tears. I choose you too. But promise me no more assumptions. No more ego deciding for us. Only honesty. Only us. George reached out, taking her hands in his, holding them with a tenderness that belied his usual strength. I promise, he whispered. No more walls. No more tests. Just us. They stood together in the quiet park, the city sprawling around them, aware of everything they had been through. The misunderstandings, the pride, the fear, and yet finally choosing each other. In that moment, the weight of weeks of tension and resistance dissolved into relief, connection, and the fragile but undeniable spark of love. Neither spoke for several minutes, simply holding hands, feeling the warmth, the pulse of life between them. George finally let a soft laugh escape, low and genuine, breaking the tension. I think I've been humbled, he admitted, smiling. Annabelle laughed too, a sound full of relief and tenderness. Good, she said softly, because humility looks good on you. The night wrapped around them like a promise. They had faced fear, misunderstanding, and the shatter point of pride. And now, they had chosen each other. And in that choice, the first step toward resolution, they discovered something neither expected. That love, unexpected yet profound, required courage not just to give, but to receive. The morning after their night in the park, the city seemed different, as if the air itself had shifted. George woke with a rare sense of lightness, the weight of ego and misunderstanding lifted. He stared out at the skyline, the sun glinting off skyscrapers, and for the first time in months he felt clarity without calculation, hope without hesitation. Annabelle arrived at the cafe, her morning ritual of coffee and pastries, but something had changed in her step. There was a subtle glow, a quiet confidence that was not just her own. She carried now the shared warmth of trust, of someone who had chosen her when the world might have pulled him away. Their first encounter that morning was not planned. She had come to grab a late breakfast before volunteering at the community center. He to pick up coffee on the way to a board meeting that could not wait. And yet, as their eyes met across the cafe, the world seemed to pause. George approached slowly, careful but eager, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at his lips. Good morning, he said, voice soft but steady, no trace of ego, only warmth. Annabelle returned the smile, gentle and luminous. Good morning, she replied. The air between them hummed with familiarity, comfort, and the delicate thrill of new beginnings. They sat together at a small corner table, untouched by the rush of the cafe around them. For a moment, words were unnecessary. They simply shared space, breathing in the calm after the storm, each aware of how far they had come from the trick question in the cafe that had started it all. You know, George said finally, stirring his coffee. I keep thinking about that day. How one simple answer changed everything. You didn't just answer a question. You changed how I see myself, how I see the world. Annabelle's eyes softened, her hands wrapped around her mug. And you challenged me too, she admitted. You forced me to step into spaces I normally wouldn't. To trust, to let someone in. And I almost didn't, but I'm glad I did. The conversation drifted easily, flowing from memories of the cafe, the gala, the shelter, to shared dreams, hopes, and quiet reflections on their pasts. Each word, each laugh, each pause, strengthened the fragile trust that had been built, broken, and rebuilt. Later that afternoon, George invited Annabelle to his penthouse, not as a display of wealth, but as a space where they could talk freely, away from distractions. The city sprawled beneath them, a reminder of the life he had once measured in power and control, now redefined by connection and choice. I want you to see the real me, he said, gesturing around the sleek apartment. Not the billionaire, not the ego, just me. Annabelle stepped inside, taking in the space with a quiet appreciation, but her focus was on him. I already do, she said softly. I see all of you, George. Even the parts you try to hide. He smiled, a mixture of humility and relief. And I see you. All of you. Even the walls you've built. Even the fears you carry. And I don't want to tear them down. I want to walk beside you, carefully, as we face them together. They spent hours talking, sharing, and laughing. George revealed childhood memories, moments of insecurity, and the lessons that had shaped his life. Annabelle spoke of her struggles, the absent figures, and the challenges she had overcome. With every story, every confession, the connection deepened. Not just attraction, but understanding, respect, and a profound emotional intimacy. By evening, the penthouse windows reflected the glow of the setting sun. George took her hand, holding it with careful warmth. Annabelle, I don't want to imagine life without you, he admitted, eyes searching hers for a sign of agreement. She smiled, leaning slightly closer. Then don't. And I won't either. In that moment, the unspoken tension of weeks, the tests, misunderstandings, pride, finally dissolved. They embraced, not as conqueror and tested, not as billionaire and waitress, but as two people who had chosen each other despite fear, despite ego, despite the unknown. Over the following days, their connection grew naturally. George found joy in the simplicity of Annabelle's world. Quiet walks, shared meals, volunteer work, and the comfort of ordinary life punctuated by extraordinary understanding. Annabelle discovered that wealth and power were not barriers to love. They could be instruments of kindness and connection when wielded with intention. The trick question in the cafe, once a moment of challenge and ego, became a symbol of the journey they had undertaken. It reminded them that love often comes unexpectedly, requiring courage, humility, and the willingness to risk everything for connection. Weeks later, on a soft Sunday morning, George and Annabelle returned to the cafe where it had all begun. They sat together, sipping coffee, laughter spilling between them like sunlight. George reached across the table, taking her hand gently. "You know," he said with a grin, "I still can't believe one answer cost me my ego, and gave me this." Annabelle laughed softly, the sound full of warmth and triumph. "And I can't believe it made me take a chance on someone I barely knew. But I'm glad I did." Their eyes met, and in that gaze was a shared understanding. The trials, the misunderstandings, the pride, they had survived it all. And in surviving, they had built something rare, enduring, and beautiful. As they left the cafe hand in hand, the city stretched before them, full of possibilities. Their journey had begun with a test, a trick, a challenge, but it ended with choice, trust, and love realized. And in every smile, every gentle touch, every shared moment, they echoed the lesson of their story. Unexpected love, once found, was worth every risk, every moment of fear, and every test of the heart. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, and George whispered softly, "Love at last, truly, unexpectedly, finally." Annabelle smiled, leaning against him as they walked into the night. Yes, love at last. The world continued around them, indifferent and vast, yet in that small space between them, everything mattered. They had been tested, they had stumbled, and they had chosen each other. The trick question had sparked something extraordinary, but it was their courage, honesty, and vulnerability that had made love endure. And so, with hearts intertwined and eyes open to both the past and the future, George and Annabelle stepped forward together, ready to face life, love, and the unexpected. Hand in hand, forever changed and forever bonded. Thank you so much for watching this story all the way to the end. Your time, your support, and your presence here mean more than words can say. If this story touched your heart, inspired you, or kept you watching, please make sure to subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss a new upload. Until next time, stay blessed, stay strong, and keep believing in love. See you in the next story.